The night Harlem went quiet, even the streetlights seemed to dim out of respect. Bumpy Johnson stood alone in his apartment, the city breathing beneath his window, holding a leash that no longer had a purpose. The dog bowl was still full. That was the part that stayed with him, not the blood, not the rumor whispered too eagerly on Lenox Avenue, but the untouched food cooling on the floor like a promise broken mid-sentence. They hadn't killed the dog because it was dangerous. They hadn't killed it because it mattered to business. They'd done it because they wanted to be seen. 5 men, hired hands with cheap suits and cheaper loyalty, thought they understood power. Thought power was noise. Thought it was cruelty performed loudly enough that it echoed. They were wrong. Bumpy didn't shout. He didn't throw things. He sat, slow and careful, as if any sudden movement might disturb the air and let something escape. Outside, a siren wailed and then cut short, like it remembered where it was and decided better of it. Harlem had learned that sound meant trouble was nearby, but not for him. By dawn, the story had already changed 3 times. By noon, names were being avoided. Men who prided themselves on knowing everything suddenly knew nothing at all. Phone calls rang unanswered. Doors that were always open stayed shut. The city began doing what it always did best when it sensed a shift in gravity. It leaned away. Bumpy finally stood, placed the leash in a drawer and closed it gently. There would be no speeches, no displays. What came next would move like weather, inevitable, impersonal, and impossible to stop once it began. Somewhere in the city, 5 men went about their day convinced the worst had already happened. They had no idea the clock had just started. The decision was made in a room that smelled of cheap cologne and old smoke, where men talked too loudly because silence made them nervous. It wasn't a strategic meeting, not really. No maps, no careful weighing of consequences. Just 5 men who had been told a name and a reputation and decided reputation was a thing that could be tested. They knew who Bumpy Johnson was, of course, everyone did. But knowing a name isn't the same as understanding it, and they mistook familiarity for insight. To them, he was an aging king in a neighborhood that had begun to change, a man whose power survived mostly on memory and myth. Myths, they believed, cracked easily when struck hard enough. The talk circled around money at first, then territory, then pride. Pride always crept in eventually. One of them laughed and said fear was the only language men like Bumpy still understood. Another nodded and suggested that fear had to be personal, something intimate enough to crawl under the skin and stay there. Not a bullet, not a burned storefront. Those were old tricks, expected tricks. The point wasn't to start a war. The point was to remind him he could bleed. Someone mentioned the dog almost as a joke. A casual comment tossed into the air to see if it would land. It did. The room went quiet for a second, and in that silence the idea settled, heavy and undeniable. They convinced themselves it was clever. Cruelty disguised as intelligence. The dog wasn't guarded like a man, didn't carry a gun, didn't have eyes always watching the street. It was domestic, harmless, something Bumpy allowed close because it didn't belong to the world he ruled. That was the logic, at least. Hurt the soft thing and the hard man would crack. They told themselves he'd be furious, reckless, sloppy. That he'd lash out and make mistakes. That was the story they needed to believe to go through with it. None of them asked why a man like Bumpy would keep a dog in the first place. They moved quickly, efficiently, the way men do when they're more afraid of thinking than acting. There was no ceremony, no hesitation worth remembering. Just an act performed and immediately compartmentalized, filed away under necessary evils. One of them turned his face aside, not out of guilt but discomfort, like someone watching a medical procedure they didn't want to fully see. Another muttered that it was just an animal, that this was business. They all agreed aloud, because agreement made it easier to breathe. What they didn't understand was the difference between sending a message and mispronouncing it. They believed the act itself was the message, that brutality spoke for itself. But messages depend on the listener, on what they value, on what they've already lost. To them, the dog was a symbol, a lever to pull. To Bumpy, it was something else entirely, something that existed outside the endless arithmetic of favors and threats. That distinction never entered their calculations. By the time they were done, they were already thinking about what came next. They imagined rumors spreading, imagined Bumpy's reaction playing out like a scene in a movie they'd seen too many times. Shouting, broken glass, maybe a retaliatory strike that proved he was still dangerous but also exposed him. They congratulated themselves quietly, not with smiles, but with a shared sense of having crossed a line together. Shared guilt can feel like camaraderie when men are wired a certain way. They underestimated the insult because they misunderstood the target. Killing the dog wasn't just violence. It was a declaration that nothing was sacred, that even the smallest mercy could be reached and destroyed. In their minds, that made the message stronger. In reality, it stripped away all ambiguity. There was no longer any room for negotiation, no chance that the offense could be reframed as business gone wrong. It became something simpler and far more dangerous. When word finally reached Bumpy, it didn't arrive with the drama they'd imagined. No breathless messenger, no theatrical reveal, just a gap where something should have been, an absence that spoke louder than any threat. The men who committed the act never saw that moment, never saw how still he became, how the room seemed to pause with him. They were already moving on, already telling themselves the hardest part was over. That was the deepest misjudgment of all. They thought cruelty was a spark meant to ignite chaos, but what it actually did was draw a line so clean and unmistakable that it simplified everything that followed. By choosing something small and defenseless, they believed they were aiming low enough to be safe. Instead, they had aimed straight at the one place where forgiveness had no reason to exist, and no room to survive. The truth didn't arrive with noise. There was no knock at the door, no panicked voice tumbling over itself to deliver the news. It came instead as a wrongness in the air, the kind you feel before you can name it. Bumpy noticed it the moment he stepped inside, the apartment too orderly, too still, like a place holding its breath. The dog should have been there, nails clicking faintly on the floor, a presence that announced itself without demanding attention. Instead, there was only silence, thick and deliberate, pressing against his ears. He called the name once, softly, more out of habit than hope. The sound fell flat, swallowed by the room. That was when he saw the bowl still full, the water untouched. Time slowed in that way it does when something fundamental shifts, when the mind resists what the eyes are already reporting. Bumpy stood there longer than anyone would expect a man like him to stand, coat still on, hat still in his hand, staring at that small, undeniable evidence. No mess, no sign of struggle, just absence. He didn't ask questions right away. Questions invited answers, and answers had a way of shaping reactions before you were ready for them. Instead, he sat down and let the silence settle. This wasn't grief the way people talked about it, loud and messy and demanding witnesses. It was quieter, colder, a realization unfolding piece by piece. The dog hadn't been taken to hurt him in some abstract way. It had been taken because someone thought they knew him well enough to predict his response. That assumption irritated him more than the loss itself. By the time the first whisper reached him, carried indirectly through a chain of cautious intermediaries, he already knew what it would contain. 5 men, a deliberate act, not an accident, not a misunderstanding. The details came haltingly, stripped of emotion by men who were afraid of saying too much or too little. Bumpy listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He didn't react when the method was hinted at, when the cruelty became explicit enough that the speaker couldn't quite meet his eyes. There was no visible anger, no tightening of the jaw, just a slight narrowing of focus, like a lens being adjusted. What settled in him then wasn't rage. Rage was loud, wasteful, prone to mistakes. This was something else, something more controlled. A certainty. He understood in that moment that the act wasn't meant to end anything. It was meant to begin something on their terms. A provocation designed to force him into motion before he'd chosen the direction. They wanted spectacle. They wanted him off balance, chasing them in public, reminding the world he was still capable of violence. They wanted to write the story and bait him into playing his part. He declined the invitation without saying a word. The insult wasn't just the killing. It was the belief that he could be hurted by pain, that his private attachments were weaknesses to be exploited rather than boundaries to be respected. They had confused restraint for softness, mercy for sentimentality. The dog had been a quiet thing, a constant that asked for nothing beyond presence. In a life defined by transactions and power plays, that constancy mattered. Its loss didn't make him reckless. It made him precise. Bumpy rose and moved through the apartment, touching nothing unnecessarily, as if preserving a crime scene no one else would ever see. He opened a drawer and placed the leash inside, not ceremoniously but carefully, an act that signaled finality. That chapter was closed. What followed would not be colored by emotion but guided by memory and principle. There were lines you did not cross if you wanted the rules to continue applying to you, and they had crossed one with enthusiasm. Outside, Harlem continued its daily rhythms, unaware of the recalibration taking place behind those walls. Vendors called out prices, cars backfired, children ran past stoops where men sat watching the street with practiced indifference. But beneath it all, a subtle shift was already spreading, like a current changing direction. People sensed when something had happened, even if they didn't know what. They adjusted instinctively, choosing caution over curiosity. Bumpy made no calls himself, he didn't need to. His silence did the work for him. In a world built on information, the absence of reaction was more unsettling than any threat. Those who knew him best understood what it meant when he didn't speak immediately. It meant he was listening, not to words but to the shape of the situation, mapping it out in his mind. He was tracing connections, recalling favors owed and debts unpaid, measuring how far the ripples would travel. The men who had committed the act waited for a response that never came. They mistook that lack of noise for hesitation, maybe even fear. They told themselves he was old, tired, uncertain. They laughed too loudly about it in bars, reassured themselves with bravado and shared drinks. They didn't realize that the moment he accepted what had been done, truly accepted it, the outcome became inevitable. There would be no negotiation because there was nothing left to negotiate. No apology could restore what had been destroyed, and no explanation could soften the intent behind it. Bumpy looked out his window as evening fell, the city lights flickering on one by one. Somewhere out there, 5 men were still breathing easy, convinced they had seized the initiative. He felt no urgency, no need to rush. Time, after all, was a resource he had learned to wield as effectively as any weapon. The insult had landed, yes, but not in the way they intended. It had clarified everything, stripped the situation down to its simplest terms. And in that clarity there was a strange, steady calm that left no doubt about what came next. The change didn't announce itself, it seeped in quietly, the way cold does when a window has been left open somewhere you can't see. Harlem had always been alive with information, a living network of glances, nods, half-heard conversations drifting out of barbershops and clubs. People knew things here, or at least knew who knew them. But now that network began to falter in small, unsettling ways. A bartender who usually talked too much suddenly found reasons to step away. A bookie claimed he'd been out all night and hadn't seen a thing. Men who prided themselves on being impossible to surprise started acting surprised by how little they knew. The 5 men noticed it separately at first. One of them tried to make a call and got nothing but a dull, endless ring. Another was told to come back tomorrow, then the next day, then not at all. Favors that should have been automatic were met with vague excuses. It felt temporary, like bad timing or coincidence, and that's what they told themselves. Coincidence was comforting because it didn't imply intention. Intention meant someone was thinking about you, and being thought about in this way was dangerous. They moved through familiar streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Eyes lingered a little longer than usual, not with hostility but with something closer to calculation. Conversations stopped when they approached, resumed only after they'd passed. Even the air felt different, heavier, like a storm gathering without clouds. None of it was dramatic enough to point to, nothing they could confront or challenge. It was the absence of normalcy that unsettled them most. One of the men laughed it off and suggested Bumpy was bluffing, that this was all theater meant to spook them. He spoke loudly, as if volume could reinforce belief. But later that night, alone, he found himself replaying the day in his head, tallying the small refusals and closed doors. He realized how much of his life depended on people answering when he called, on systems that worked because someone allowed them to. The idea that those systems could simply stop responding gnawed at him. Another tried to assert control by making noise of his own. He picked a fight in a club, broke a bottle, reminded everyone he was still someone to be feared. The result was underwhelming. The owner had him escorted out without incident, his name spoken politely, almost apologetically, as if violence were an inconvenience rather than a threat. Outside, the street swallowed him whole, indifferent to his anger. Fear, he discovered, didn't travel the way it used to. What none of them could see was the pattern forming around them, deliberate and patient. People who owed Bumpy favors were being reminded, gently, of old kindnesses. People who depended on his goodwill were encouraged to step back, to let certain connections cool. No one was ordered to do anything. That was the genius of it. They were simply given space to make the sensible choice, and the sensible choice, almost universally, was distance. The city was very good at isolating people without touching them. As hours passed, the five men began to feel exposed, like actors who had stepped onto a stage only to realize the audience had vanished. They checked their surroundings more often, scanned faces for recognition that never came. They were used to being known, even notorious. Now they were being ignored in a way that felt deliberate. It wasn't anonymity, it was erasure in progress. They started turning on each other in subtle ways. Accusations slipped into conversation, questions about who had talked too much, who had been seen where. Trust, already thin, frayed further under the pressure of uncertainty. One of them suggested laying low for a while, another scoffed and said hiding only made you look guilty. Each opinion revealed fear in a different shape, and none of them offered comfort. Meanwhile, Harlem adjusted. Routes changed, meetings were postponed indefinitely. Names that had once opened doors were now met with polite confusion. It wasn't hostility. Hostility could be confronted. This was something colder, a collective decision to pretend certain people were no longer part of the ecosystem. Like a body rejecting a foreign object, the neighborhood was quietly pushing them out. They didn't know how fast the clock was moving. To them it felt slow, drawn out, every hour stretching longer than the last. To everyone else it was efficient, almost elegant. By nightfall each man found himself alone in some way that mattered. One was stranded without transportation he'd taken for granted. Another realized no one was watching his back anymore. A third sensed he was being guided, subtly, toward a meeting he hadn't planned, the suggestion delivered by someone who sounded friendly but left no room for refusal. The most unsettling part was that no threats were made. No warnings delivered. There was nothing to react against, nothing to negotiate. It was as if the city itself had decided on an outcome, and was now rearranging pieces to accommodate it. The five men were no longer players, just objects in motion, carried along by forces they could feel but not see. They thought of Bumpy then, finally, not as a man but as a presence. Something woven so deeply into the fabric of the place that opposing him meant opposing the place itself. The realization came too late to be useful. By the time they understood that the quiet wasn't hesitation but preparation, that the doors closing were not temporary inconveniences but permanent decisions, the last of the day's light had faded, and Harlem settled into a calm that felt ominously complete. Each of the five men believed in his own way that he could still slip free if he moved carefully enough. Isolation doesn't always feel like danger at first. Sometimes it feels like relief, like the noise has finally died down and you can think again. That illusion carried them through the early hours, convincing them they were choosing solitude rather than being forced into it. They didn't realize how deliberately their paths were being narrowed, how every option left to them pointed in a single direction. The first was invited into a sense of safety. An old acquaintance found him near a diner just before dawn, clapped him on the shoulder, spoke softly about a place he could lie low for a few hours. It sounded reasonable, even generous. The streets were quiet, the city half asleep, and the man was tired of scanning faces for threats that never materialized. He followed without resistance, not noticing how the route avoided familiar corners, how the buildings grew more industrial, less lived-in. The door closed behind him with an ordinary click, and only then did the silence change, becoming heavier, intentional. The second thought he was taking control. He decided to leave Harlem entirely for the day, to get some distance and clear his head. But transportation has its own loyalties, and the car he expected to use wasn't where it should have been. Another ride fell through. When he finally secured one, it came with a detour he didn't question because impatience had dulled his instincts. He told himself he was still moving on his own terms, even as the city quietly redirected him, block by block, into a place he had no reason to be. The third was drawn by familiarity. A bar he'd frequented for years, a bartender who knew his drink without asking, a stool that felt like home. He didn't notice how empty the place was until he'd already sat down, how the usual background chatter had been replaced by a low hum that felt staged. The bartender served him with a steady hand and avoided his eyes, and the man mistook that for professionalism. When the door locked, it was almost gentle, as if meant to preserve the atmosphere rather than disrupt it. The fourth believed he was meeting an ally. Someone whispered that there was a misunderstanding, that things had gone too far too fast, that a conversation could smooth it over. The word conversation did most of the work, suggesting equality, the possibility of explanation. He straightened his jacket, rehearsed what he would say, convinced himself he could talk his way out of anything if given the chance. He arrived early, which felt like initiative, but was really just punctuality for an appointment he hadn't scheduled. The fifth resisted longest. He sensed the pattern forming, felt the pressure closing in from all sides, and decided to disappear entirely. He avoided known places, took longer routes, stayed in motion. For a while it worked. Movement creates the illusion of agency. But constant motion requires resources, and resources depend on networks already quietly severed. When exhaustion finally caught him, it did so in a place that offered shelter without safety, anonymity without protection. None of them saw Bumpy during these hours. He remained distant, a fixed point around which everything else revolved. His presence was implied rather than demonstrated, felt in the efficiency with which events unfolded. People spoke his name rarely, and when they did, it was with a tone that suggested inevitability rather than threat. This wasn't about anger seeking release. It was about balance being restored. Each man experienced his moment of realization differently. For one, it came when he understood no one was coming for him, that the isolation wasn't temporary. For another, it came when he recognized the precision of the setup, how much effort had gone into making his choices feel voluntary. They all shared the same underlying thought, though none of them voiced it aloud. This was happening because of something they had done, and there was no version of the story where it ended differently. The spaces they were drawn into varied in appearance but not in purpose. Unremarkable rooms, closed-off corners of the city, places designed to be forgotten as soon as they were emptied. There was no spectacle, no audience. What happened there was meant to resolve a problem, not create a legend. Fear lingered, thick and private, stripped of bravado and excuses. Whatever courage they'd borrowed from numbers evaporated in solitude. What bound these moments together was their timing. Each man was taken out of circulation without disrupting the city's rhythm. like removing faulty parts from a machine that continued to run smoothly. News didn't travel because there was nothing sensational to report. No gunfire echoing down streets, no bodies displayed as warnings. Just 5 threads quietly cut. By the time the sun rose again, Harlem had already absorbed the absence. People went about their routines aware on some level that something had concluded, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. The men who had believed themselves untouchable were no longer factors to be considered, their choices rendered irrelevant by a process they had set in motion themselves. And somewhere beyond the reach of those closed rooms, Bumpy moved through his day with the same measured calm as always, knowing that the isolation had done its work exactly as intended and that nothing of importance remained unfinished by the time the 24 hours had passed. The city had already decided how to remember the day, which was to say it barely remembered it at all. Morning came the way it always did, light spilling between buildings, shop owners unlocking doors, deliveries arriving on schedule. Harlem had learned long ago that survival depended on continuity, on the ability to absorb shocks without announcing them. 5 men had vanished from circulation and the streets adjusted as if correcting a minor imbalance. There were no public confirmations, no names printed anywhere. Absence works best when it isn't explained. People noticed, of course. Someone remarked that a familiar face hadn't been seen around. Another shrugged and suggested he'd moved on, found work elsewhere, fallen out of favor. Speculation never hardened into curiosity. Curiosity was dangerous and everyone knew it. The story ended where it needed to, with silence doing the work words could not. The places the 5 men had touched began to shed them quickly. A stool at the bar was taken by someone new. A corner once claimed was quietly reclaimed by the neighborhood itself. Debts they'd been owed evaporated, reassigned without discussion. The city has a way of redistributing weight when it senses that something has been removed. What remained was smoother, more efficient, less burdened by unpredictability. Bumpy Johnson did not mark the day in any visible way. He walked the same streets, nodded to the same people, conducted business with the same deliberate patience. Those who looked closely might have noticed a subtle easing, a tension released so quietly it was almost imperceptible. Balance had been restored, not through excess but through completion. The matter was closed, and closed matters did not require revisiting. What lingered instead was a lesson, one that traveled without being carried. Men spoke more carefully. Jokes softened at the edges. Cruelty, when discussed at all, was framed as something that invited consequences far beyond its initial intent. No one mentioned the dog outright, but everyone understood. Certain things were not to be touched, not because they were guarded, but because they represented a line that, once crossed, erased all remaining options. Fear did not spike, it settled. There is a difference. Spikes fade quickly, burn out, demand constant renewal. Settled fear becomes part of the landscape, informing decisions without dominating them. It reminded people that power was not always loud, that the most decisive actions often left the fewest traces. The warning embedded itself not in headlines or whispers, but in behavior. Those who had aligned themselves loosely with the 5 men adjusted their loyalties without ceremony. This was not betrayal so much as survival, an instinctive recalibration. The city rewarded those who understood when to step back, when to let events conclude without inserting themselves. Life went on, and that was precisely the point. The outcome was not meant to inspire awe or outrage. It was meant to close a chapter cleanly. Somewhere, a drawer remained closed, a leash resting inside it, unseen and undisturbed. It did not become a symbol, at least not publicly. Symbols invite interpretation, and interpretation invites argument. This was simpler than that. An action had been taken, a response delivered, and the ledger balanced. There was no need to commemorate what had been resolved. The 5 men became cautionary gaps in conversation, pauses where a name might have been. Their end, whatever its specifics, mattered less than its efficiency. No one could point to a single moment and say this was when it happened. That uncertainty was intentional. It ensured that the focus stayed on cause rather than spectacle, on the choice that had initiated everything. Harlem returned fully to itself by nightfall. Music drifted out of windows, laughter spilled onto sidewalks. The city exhaled, not in relief but in recognition of its own resilience. It had seen worse, survived worse, and learned how to metabolize violence into order when necessary. The lesson remained, quietly reinforced, ready to be remembered the next time someone mistook cruelty for leverage. And in that calm, the warning endured, not carved into walls or spoken aloud, but woven into the collective understanding that some acts did not provoke chaos or negotiation, only certainty. And that certainty, once set in motion, carried through to its conclusion without pause or regret.